In the summer of 1944, the skies above the Balkans burned with fire and smoke. Allied bombers of the 15th Air Force thundered over Eastern Europe on perilous missions to cripple Nazi Germany's oil supply, the lifeblood of the Wehrmacht's war machine. Their target, the sprawling oil refineries at Ploiești, Romania, one of Hitler's most protected assets. From the air, it looked like a fortress, ringed with flak batteries, guarded by fighter squadrons, and defended with ruthless precision. For every plane that made it home, another was torn apart in flames. By mid-1944, more than 500 Allied airmen, mostly Americans flying B-24 Liberators and B-17 Flying Fortresses, were shot down or forced to bail out over Axis-occupied Yugoslavia. For most, capture or death seemed inevitable. The region was a patchwork of warring factions: German occupiers, fascist collaborators, communist partisans, and royalist Chetniks, each controlling fragments of a country torn apart. Into this chaos fell the stranded pilots and gunners, men who had survived the firestorm above, only to face the uncertainty of enemy territory below. Yet, amid the danger, something remarkable began to happen. Local villagers in the mountainous heart of Serbia, farmers, shepherds, and peasants who had little to give, risked everything to protect the airmen. They offered food, shelter, and secrecy, hiding them in barns and caves while German patrols combed the countryside. These villagers were loyal to General Draža Mihailović and his Royal Yugoslav Army in the homeland, better known as the Chetniks. Though their reputation would later be clouded by politics, their actions during those months saved countless Allied lives. The Germans knew the region was infested with resistance fighters. Wehrmacht and Gestapo detachments routinely raided villages suspected of harboring Allied personnel. Posters offered rewards for information. Captured helpers were executed, often in public. Still, the locals refused to betray the airmen. One survivor, Lieutenant Richard Fellman of the 415th Bomb Squadron, later wrote, "We didn't understand their language, but we understood their courage. They guarded us like brothers." Meanwhile, in Italy, intelligence officers of the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, America's wartime spy agency, began piecing together fragments of intercepted messages and reports from Yugoslavia. Something extraordinary was happening behind enemy lines. Hundreds of missing airmen were alive. But communication was nearly impossible. Radio contact was sporadic, and the terrain made infiltration deadly. The OSS needed to know who was holding them, and more importantly, how to bring them out. The Allies had long debated which Yugoslav resistance faction to support. Churchill had shifted his favor to Tito's communist partisans, who were inflicting heavy losses on German forces. Mihailovic's royalist Chetniks, once hailed as heroes, were now viewed with suspicion, accused of occasional collaboration to fight their communist rivals. This political fog threatened to bury the stranded airmen in bureaucracy before any rescue could begin. Still, within the OSS's Bari headquarters in southern Italy, a handful of officers refused to let the matter drop. Lieutenant George Mussolini, an American of Serbian descent and veteran of Balkan operations, was one of them. He pushed for a daring plan: parachute into Mihailovic's territory, confirm the airmen's safety, and organize an extraction. The idea bordered on suicidal. German forces were stationed throughout western Serbia, and the Luftwaffe maintained air superiority over the region. Yet if Mussolini's intelligence was correct, the stakes were enormous. More than 500 Allied airmen trapped behind enemy lines, waiting for help that might never come. In the hills near the village of Pranjani, the stranded men continued to wait. They had been stranded for weeks, some for months, surviving on what little food the villagers could spare. They built makeshift signals on mountain slopes, enormous white stones spelling out US or help, hoping Allied reconnaissance might spot them. Days turned into weeks, and still no aircraft appeared. Each night, the distant sound of German trucks reminded them how thin the line between life and capture had become. For the villagers, the situation was no less dire. Every new airman who fell from the sky brought joy, another life saved, but also danger. They knew the Germans were tightening their grip. Patrols grew more frequent. Spies roamed the countryside. One careless whisper could mean disaster for hundreds. Then one evening, as a group of airmen huddled around a flickering oil lamp in a mountain farmhouse, they heard news from their Serbian hosts. The Allies knew they were there. Plans were being made to reach them, relief mixed with disbelief. Could anyone possibly reach this far into occupied territory? The mission that would follow codenamed Operation Halyard, would become the largest and most successful air rescue of downed pilots in World War II. But in that moment, surrounded by uncertainty, few could imagine how such an operation would even begin. How could hundreds of men be flown out from under the nose of the German army without a single loss? The answer lay hidden in those dark Serbian hills, waiting to be written into history. By late July 1944, the mystery of the missing airmen had become too large to ignore. In Allied intelligence circles, whispers of their survival circulated through coded OSS channels and Air Force reports. Commanders in Bari, Italy, headquarters of the 15th Air Force, debated whether the rumors were credible. How could hundreds of downed airmen survive for months in Axis-controlled Yugoslavia without being discovered or betrayed? To find out, the Office of Strategic Services authorized a high-risk mission under the command of Lieutenant George Mussolini, an American officer with Serbian heritage and deep knowledge of the Balkans. Mussolini was a seasoned operative. He had served in Yugoslavia before, coordinating with Chetnik leader General Draža Mihailović, a former officer of the Royal Yugoslav Army. Mihailović, now leading the resistance against German occupation, had built a network of loyal fighters across Serbia's rugged mountains. Yet the political landscape had changed drastically. The Allies, swayed by reports from British missions favouring Tito's communist partisans, had largely abandoned the Chetniks. Officially, Mihailović was no longer recognised as an ally. For Mussolini to contact him now, and rely on his men, would be an act of defiance against the shifting winds of Allied policy. Still, Mussolini believed Mihailović's forces were the only ones capable of protecting and organising the trapped airmen. The Chetniks controlled remote areas the Germans rarely patrolled, and they maintained loyalty among local villagers. Against orders that leaned toward neutrality, Mussolini began preparing a covert drop into Serbian territory to confirm the situation firsthand. On the night of August 2, 1944, an OSS C-47 Dakota lifted off from Bari under the cover of darkness. Aboard were Lieutenant Mussolini, radio operator Arthur "Jibby" Jibilian, and a small team of trained operatives. Their mission: locate the American airmen reportedly being hidden by the villagers of Pranjani, make radio contact with Allied command, and organize an extraction plan. If discovered, they would be executed as spies. Their parachutes opened silently over the forested hills of Ravnogora, the heartland of Mihailović's resistance. Within hours, they were surrounded, not by the enemy, but by armed Chetniks who had been expecting them. What followed was a cautious meeting between worlds divided by war and politics. In a candlelit farmhouse, Mussolini met General Mihailović face to face. The general, dressed in his weathered Yugoslav army uniform, had been leading guerrilla warfare against German occupiers since 1941. He presented Mussolini with a handwritten list, the names of over 200 Allied airmen currently hiding in villages across western Serbia. Many were Americans, some were British. All were alive, waiting for rescue. "They are our guests," Mihailović reportedly told Mussolini. "We protect them as our own soldiers." It was a revelation and a challenge. The number of survivors was far greater than expected, and extracting them would require coordination on a scale the OSS had never attempted before. Every rescue flight would have to penetrate hundreds of kilometers of enemy airspace, land, and take off from rough terrain, and do so without alerting German patrols stationed nearby. Radio communication was limited. Any transmission could be intercepted. Mussolini's team set up a clandestine radio station, codenamed Ranger, to send encrypted updates back to Bari. The first message stunned Allied command. Hundreds of airmen safe, extraction possible, immediate airstrip construction underway. But while plans were being formed, the danger on the ground intensified. German divisions from the 7th SS Volunteer Mountain Division, Prince Eugen, were sweeping through Serbia, hunting resistance cells. Collaborationist forces under Milan Nedić also sought to root out Mihailović's supporters. The Chetniks, armed mostly with old rifles and captured weapons, could do little but hide and deceive. Each day the airmen remained on the ground. Their risk of discovery grew. In one instance, an American airman named John Mendel was nearly captured when German troops raided a nearby village. He escaped only after Chetnik fighters ambushed the patrol and led him into the forest. "They fought for us," Mendel later recalled, "as if we were their own brothers. I can never forget that." Meanwhile, Mussolini's team began scouting for a landing site, somewhere remote, flat, and long enough to handle a C-47 transport. The search was desperate and dangerous. Locals whispered of a plateau near Pranjani, known as WWII Polje, where livestock once grazed. It was uneven, rocky, and visible from several ridges. Far from ideal, but it was the only chance. With Mihailovic's approval, hundreds of villagers began the impossible task, building a secret airfield in the middle of occupied Europe, using only hand tools and muscle. Night after night, they worked in silence. Men and women carried stones by hand, flattening the field by moonlight to avoid German aircraft. Some even used oxen to drag makeshift rollers fashioned from tree trunks. Children stood watch on the hills, ready to warn of approaching patrols. It was a race against time and against discovery. Back in Bari, skepticism lingered. Many Allied officials doubted the operation could succeed, or even that Mihailovic's men could be trusted. Yet Mussolin's coded messages painted a different picture, one of coordination, loyalty, and remarkable courage. Slowly, approval was granted for a daring air rescue attempt. As August 1944 reached its midpoint, the stage was set. In the Serbian mountains, a hidden airfield waited. Hundreds of airmen prayed for deliverance. And in the skies above the Adriatic, American pilots prepared to attempt what no one believed was possible, landing deep inside enemy territory to bring their brothers home. The mission was ready to begin, but one question remained. How long could they keep it secret from the Germans? The sound of hammers and shovels echoed faintly through the valleys of western Serbia. On a high plateau near the village of Pranjani, hundreds of peasants and stranded airmen worked shoulder to shoulder, transforming rough farmland into a secret runway. It was August 1944, and the outcome of one of World War II's most daring rescues hinged on a single field. WWII Polje. Every blow of a shovel was a gamble with death. The Germans were less than 30 kilometers away, patrolling the main roads and combing villages suspected of sheltering Allied personnel. Overhead, Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft occasionally swept across the hills, their cameras scanning for any signs of Allied activity. For the Chetniks, villagers, and airmen, concealment was everything. The runway could not be discovered, not until it was ready, and not until the planes arrived. Lieutenant George Mussolini oversaw the construction with the quiet intensity of a man who knew failure meant annihilation. The OSS had selected him for his unflinching resolve, but even he understood the enormity of what they were attempting. The C-47 transport aircraft that would fly the rescue required a landing strip at least 700 yards long, flat, firm, and clear of obstacles. The plateau was uneven and riddled with stones, but it was all they had. "The people moved mountains for us," recalled Staff Sergeant Arthur "Jibby" Jibilian, the team's radio operator. "They didn't have machines or even proper tools, just picks, shovels, and faith. They believed God and America were watching." By day, villagers pretended to go about their normal routines, tending fields, herding livestock, hauling wood. By night, they returned to WWII Polje with the airmen to dig, clear, and level. The men marked out the runway using simple stakes and white stones. To dampen dust that might give away their position, they sprinkled the field with water fetched from nearby wells. Local farmers even volunteered their oxen to drag heavy wooden rollers across the soil to pack it down. Meanwhile, Mussolini maintained radio contact with OSS command in Bari, using the codename Ranger. Each transmission was brief, coded, and fraught with risk. Runway progressing. Locals cooperative. Estimated completion 4 days, one message read. If the Germans intercepted even one of these signals, they would know an Allied operation was underway. As the airfield neared completion, danger tightened its grip. German patrols intensified across the region, particularly after reports of Allied airmen being spotted near Chachak and Kraljevo. Villages suspected of resistance were burned, and several men were executed as examples. Yet Pranjani remained undetected, shielded by a combination of terrain, secrecy, and the absolute loyalty of its inhabitants. Not a single villager betrayed the operation, despite threats of death. On the morning of August 9th, 1944, Mussolini stood at the edge of the newly completed runway, scanning the horizon. The strip stretched nearly 2,000 feet, barely enough for a C-47 to land safely in daylight, let alone at night. The plan was audacious. 3 transport aircraft from the 60th Troop Carrier Group would attempt a nighttime landing, guided only by makeshift torches and the hope that German patrols wouldn't see the glow. That afternoon, Mussolini's radio crackled with confirmation. The rescue flights were on their way. Operation Halyard was officially underway. As dusk fell, the villagers and airmen lined the runway, each holding a lantern shielded by cloth. A gentle wind rolled down from the mountains, carrying the scent of pine and smoke. "We could hear them before we could see them," one survivor recalled. The low rumble of engines, it was the sweetest sound in the world. Then, out of the darkness, the first C-47 appeared, its outline faint against the starlit sky. The pilots, led by Lieutenant Richard Fellman's comrades from the 15th Air Force, had navigated treacherous mountain terrain using only moonlight and compass bearings. With remarkable precision, the first plane touched down on the uneven strip, bouncing hard but holding steady. The villagers erupted in quiet cheers, quickly muffled to avoid detection. Within minutes, the first group of rescued airmen, weak, thin, but alive, climbed aboard. The pilot kept engines running, fearful that idling too long would attract attention. "We loaded them fast," Mussolini said later. "Every second counted." As the first aircraft lifted off, its wheels barely clearing the tree line, hearts stopped across the field. But the plane rose smoothly into the night sky, its silhouette swallowed by darkness. 2 more aircraft followed, each taking off under impossible conditions. Down below, those left behind could only watch the faint navigation lights fade toward the west. For the first time in months, hope soared above occupied Serbia. But the mission was far from over. Hundreds of airmen still remained scattered across the mountains. The Germans had not yet realized what had happened, but it was only a matter of time. Mussolini and Mihailovich knew the operation would have to continue in phases, each more dangerous than the last. As dawn broke over Pranjani, the villagers covered the airstrip once more with grazing animals and farm tools, erasing all trace of the previous night's miracle. The C-47s reached Bari safely, their passengers stunned to find themselves alive and free. Back in the mountains, Mussolini prepared for the next round of evacuations. The Germans would soon begin asking questions. Luftwaffe patrols would increase. Someone, somewhere, would notice the missing men. And when that happened, the hidden field of Pranjani would become the most dangerous patch of earth in all of Yugoslavia. The first rescue had succeeded, but it had also started a clock ticking. The longer Operation Halyard continued, the greater the chance that the Nazis would discover the impossible secret unfolding right beneath their watchful eyes. The night of August 10th, 1944, brought with it a tense, breathless silence across the mountains of western Serbia. The first phase of Operation Halyard had been a stunning success. 3 American C-47 transport aircraft had defied every law of wartime probability, landing and taking off from a hidden meadow in Nazi-occupied territory without alerting a single German patrol. But for Lieutenant George Mussolini and General Draža Mihailovich, the triumph was only the beginning. Over 500 Allied airmen still waited in remote Serbian villages, each depending on the miracle of flight to escape a land crawling with German troops. In the days that followed the first evacuation, Pranjani became a temporary fortress of secrecy. The airfield at Galovica Polja was camouflaged again, animals grazing across the soil that only hours earlier had launched aircraft into the night sky. Villagers took turns standing watch from the surrounding hills, their eyes trained on the roads leading from Čačak and Kraljevo, where German convoys were known to patrol. The operation's greatest asset was its invisibility, and that veil could not be torn, not even for a moment. The OSS team remained in constant motion. Radio operator Arthur Jibilian, often working from barns or forest clearings, transmitted encrypted updates to Barry under the codename Ranger. Each message was short, clinical but heavy with tension. 3 successful extractions, airstrip secure, additional groups prepared for pickup. Barry's response was swift. Additional flights were authorized, more crews briefed, and the 15th Air Force prepared to commit further resources to an operation that, on paper, should have been impossible. By mid-August, the German High Command began receiving fragmented intelligence of American airmen seen with local rebels. The Gestapo in Belgrade issued new orders to increase surveillance in the Morava Valley, and SS patrols from the Prince Eugen Division tightened their grip on the region. Rumors circulated that Tito's partisans had been tipped off to the operation, though they offered no assistance. Politically, Mihailovich's Chetniks were now a liability to Allied diplomacy. Yet paradoxically, they were the only ones saving Allied lives on the ground. The irony was not lost on Mussolini. "We were rescuing American heroes," he later said, "and doing it with men the Allies no longer wanted to acknowledge." As the days passed, the tension grew unbearable. German reconnaissance aircraft were spotted twice overhead, forcing all runway activity to cease. The villagers, disciplined and determined, spread fresh hay over the airstrip and led cattle across it to mask its outline. Children were instructed not to speak of the airplanes, even in whispers. Still, the operation could not wait. The stranded airmen, scattered across dozens of small hamlets, were running out of food. Several were suffering from infected wounds sustained during their crashes or weeks of hiding in the wilderness. On August 10th, the second phase began. The sound of aircraft engines once again rolled through the valleys like thunder in the night. This time, 6 C-47 Dakotas and an escort of P-51 Mustangs approached from the west. The pilots had orders to fly at low altitude, hugging the terrain to evade radar and German night fighters. The airmen waiting below could hardly believe what they were witnessing. American warplanes landing on a mountain meadow in the very heart of occupied Yugoslavia. Each landing was a feat of skill and nerve. The C-47s came in steep, hit the ground hard and rolled to a stop just meters from the field's edge. Villagers rushed from the shadows, guiding the wounded and weary toward the aircraft. Men who had spent weeks hiding in barns and caves now clutched photographs, letters, and small souvenirs given by their Serbian hosts. Some embraced the villagers who had risked everything for them. Others simply wept. "We didn't know how to thank them," one airman later said. "They were starving themselves, yet they made sure we ate first." The loading process was a choreography of urgency. Within minutes, the aircraft filled with rescued crews, pilots, gunners, navigators, each man accounted for by name and unit. Mussolini directed the operation with calm precision, keeping a close eye on the tree line where German patrols could appear at any moment. In one tense instance, a flicker of light was spotted in the distance, possibly a patrol vehicle. The engines roared to life, and the planes lifted off one after another, their silhouettes vanishing into the night sky before the danger could reach them. By dawn, nearly 100 additional airmen were safe in Bari. Not a single plane had been lost. The rescue flights continued through September and October, each executed with the same haunting mix of precision and peril. Supplies were occasionally dropped in return. Food, medicine, and even cigarettes for the villagers who had risked everything. But with each successful extraction, the risk of discovery grew exponentially. German forces were tightening their net, and word of Mihailovich's cooperation with the Americans began circulating through enemy ranks. Luftwaffe reconnaissance intensified, and the Wehrmacht launched new operations deeper into the Serbian countryside. Still, the operation remained untouched. Some would later call it luck, others, providence. But to those who were there, it was discipline, courage, and the silence of hundreds of people who refused to betray a secret that could have cost them their lives. By October, Operation Halyard had rescued more than 500 airmen without a single casualty, an achievement unmatched in the history of air warfare. Yet as the last of the C-47s lifted off from Galovica Polja, Lieutenant Mussolini knew the mission had entered dangerous political territory. The world beyond the mountains was changing fast. Tito's partisans were winning favor, Mihailovich's Chetniks were being sidelined, and Washington's priorities were shifting toward the endgame in Europe. The official reports would soon minimize, even erase, the Chetniks' role in the mission. But for the men who had lived it, for those who had walked through fire and flown home through darkness, the truth could not be forgotten. The fields of Pranjani fell silent once more. The makeshift runway returned to grass, but somewhere in the valleys below, the echo of the engines lingered, the sound of freedom, rising above a land still chained by war. And as word of the rescues began to trickle into German command, a new question loomed. How had hundreds of Americans vanished from under the Reich's nose without a trace? By the fall of 1944, Operation Halyard had evolved into something beyond a rescue. It was a symbol of quiet defiance, of courage hidden beneath layers of secrecy and politics. The mission had already airlifted more than 500 Allied airmen out of Nazi-occupied Yugoslavia without losing a single life or aircraft. It was a feat so improbable that many in Allied command initially refused to believe the reports. And yet, deep in the hills of Western Serbia, the evidence was undeniable. The villagers of Pranjani and the Chetnik fighters of General Draža Mihailović had achieved the impossible. Still, the war was shifting. As the Allied advance pressed through Italy and France, the focus turned toward the Balkans, not just as a battlefield, but as a political powder keg. Winston Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt had already begun backing Josip Broz Tito's communist partisans as the official Yugoslav resistance. Mihailović, once hailed as a hero, was now labeled unreliable, accused of sporadic collaboration with Axis forces. The truth, however, was far more complex and buried under layers of wartime propaganda. In the villages where the rescue had unfolded, these shifting alliances were felt like tremors beneath the earth. For the Serbian peasants who had sheltered downed American flyers, politics meant little. They had acted out of humanity, faith, and shared hatred for the occupier. But for Mussolini and his OSS team, politics suddenly became the invisible enemy threatening to undo their success. The very people who had risked everything to save Allied airmen were being quietly erased from the story. Lieutenant George Mussolini himself was recalled to Bari in early September 1944. Officially, it was to debrief and prepare for further operations. Unofficially, he had become a political inconvenience. His open cooperation with Mihailović had drawn criticism from British intelligence, who viewed continued contact with the Chetniks as undermining support for Tito's partisans. The OSS, under pressure, removed Mussolini from the field. He protested fiercely, insisting that Mihailović's forces had been essential to saving Allied lives. But in the high offices of Allied command, military gratitude often bent under the weight of diplomatic necessity. In his absence, OSS operations in Serbia continued under new leadership, including Captain Nick Lalić and Lieutenant Jibilian, who both respected Mussolini's groundwork. Lalić, another American of Serbian descent, was pragmatic and resourceful, traits that would be crucial in the final extraction missions. He maintained radio contact with Mihailović, coordinated additional flights, and supervised the relocation of surviving airmen from scattered villages to the Pranjani region. Though increasingly surrounded by enemy patrols, the Chetniks persisted, their loyalty unwavering. German command, however, was no longer oblivious. By mid-September, Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights began capturing grainy aerial photographs hinting at unusual ground activity near Pranjani. Reports described flattened terrain with unnatural patterns, the faint scars of the hidden airfield. In response, SS patrols swept through nearby settlements, interrogating villagers and burning homes suspected of aiding the resistance. Yet miraculously, the Germans never found the exact location. The airstrip remained a ghost, a patch of earth that appeared and vanished between their maps. Each new flight of C-47s that landed under the cover of darkness brought home another group of exhausted, grateful men. Some had spent months in hiding, surviving on bread, goat milk, and the kindness of strangers. Others carried scars, both physical and psychological, from their crash landings and constant fear of capture. When they finally reached the safety of Bari, their testimonies astonished Allied debriefers. "The Chetniks fed us before they fed themselves," one pilot reported. "They risk death every day. Without them, none of us would have made it out." Despite these first-hand accounts, official recognition for Mihailović and his men remained elusive. Reports sent to London and Washington were filtered through political channels increasingly aligned with Tito's partisans. OSS agents who spoke in favor of the Chetniks found their recommendations buried or redacted. Operation Halyard was quietly labeled classified, its details restricted even among military personnel. Back in Serbia, Mihailović's situation grew desperate. German reprisals intensified, and his movement was gradually pushed eastward as partisan forces, now supported by Soviet units, gained the upper hand. Still, he refused to betray the Allied flyers he had protected. When asked years later why he had risked his entire command to save foreign soldiers, one of Mihailović's officers replied simply, "Because they were fighting the same war we were." By the end of October 1944, the last Halyard flights departed from improvised landing strips further south, near Kokeljeva and Boljanic. The operation's final tally was staggering. 512 Allied airmen rescued, none lost to enemy action. The OSS closed the mission as an unqualified success. But as the war's political landscape hardened into the first shadows of the Cold War, Operation Halyard faded into obscurity. In the official histories written after 1945, Tito's partisans were celebrated as Yugoslavia's saviors. Mihailović's name, once synonymous with resistance, became a cautionary tale, branded as a traitor and executed by the new communist government in 1946. His role in Halyard was omitted, his heroism erased. For decades, few outside a small circle of veterans and historians even knew the full story. Yet among those rescued, the men who had walked out of occupied Europe and flown home through the darkness, the truth lived on. Many returned to America and built quiet lives, but every year they gathered in remembrance. They wrote letters, testified to Congress, and told anyone who would listen about the villagers of Pranjani and the Chetnik soldiers who had stood guard over them. "They saved our lives," one veteran said, "and the world forgot theirs." As the war drew toward its close, the secret airfield of Pranjani returned to the soil, its scars covered by grass and memory. But beneath the surface, the echoes of propellers still lingered. The sound of faith, loyalty, and sacrifice buried by politics. And though the guns of Europe would soon fall silent, the story of Operation Halyard was not over. History had hidden it well, but history also has a way of remembering. For decades after the guns of World War II fell silent, the story of Operation Halyard remained buried beneath the rubble of politics, secrecy, and shifting alliances. What had been one of the largest and most flawless air rescues in history was reduced to a footnote, overshadowed by the narratives the post-war world chose to remember. In the new Yugoslavia, ruled by Josip Broz Tito's communist regime, even mentioning General Draža Mihailovic's name became an act of defiance. His role in rescuing over 500 Allied airmen was erased, his memory vilified, his name written in history books only as the traitor. But the truth, as it often does, refused to stay silent. The first sparks of rediscovery began with the men who had lived it. The rescued airmen, now aging veterans scattered across America and the United Kingdom, never forgot what they owed to the people of Serbia. Some had returned home to parades, others to quiet civilian life, but all carried a debt of gratitude that time could not erase. In letters to the US State Department and testimony before Congress, they spoke of the villagers who had hidden them from German patrols, of the peasants who shared their last scraps of bread, and of the Chetnik fighters who guarded them through rain, hunger, and fear. "We were strangers," wrote Lieutenant John Capello, one of the rescued pilots. "They owed us nothing, yet they treated us as brothers. The world should know what they did, but for years their pleas went unanswered." The Cold War had frozen the truth as solidly as the Iron Curtain itself. Acknowledging Mihailovic's heroism would mean recognizing the humanity of a man condemned by America's new ally, Tito, a political impossibility in the climate of East-West tension. It wasn't until the late 1970s and early 1980s that declassified OSS reports began surfacing, revealing the full scope of the mission. In 1970, the US Air Force officially confirmed that Operation Halyard had rescued 512 airmen without a single loss, an unmatched achievement in the annals of warfare. By then, most of the key figures were gone. Mihailovic had been executed in 1946 after a show trial, accused of collaboration and treason. Lieutenant George Mussolini died in 1987, still bitter that his government had never properly honored the men and villagers who made the mission possible. Arthur Jibby Jibilian, the OSS radio operator, spent years speaking publicly about Halyard, driven by one goal: to make sure the world finally knew the truth. The rediscovery of Operation Halyard struck historians as both extraordinary and tragic. Extraordinary for its daring and precision, tragic for the political betrayal that followed. It was, one researcher later wrote, the greatest rescue story never told. The operation's success was built not on machinery or command orders, but on human decency, on farmers, mothers, and children who stood against tyranny with nothing but courage and faith. For every rescued pilot, there were dozens of villagers who risked, and often lost, everything to make it possible. In 2005, after years of quiet lobbying by surviving airmen and historians, the US government formally recognized General Draža Mihailovic for his role in saving American lives. His daughter, Gordana Mihailovic, accepted the Legion of Merit Medal on his behalf in a private ceremony in Belgrade, 60 years after her father's death. It was not redemption, but remembrance. For the veterans who had fought for decades to see the truth restored, it was a final act of justice. "It was never about politics," one of them said. "It was about gratitude." Today the fields of Pranjani are peaceful again. Where C-47s once roared under enemy skies, wildflowers now grow. A small memorial stands near the spot where villagers once lit lanterns to guide the rescue planes in. The names of the airmen and their Serbian protectors are etched into stone, silent witnesses to an episode that defied the darkness of war. Each year, descendants of both sides, Americans and Serbs, gather there to honor what was nearly forgotten. Operation Halyard endures as more than a military achievement. It is a story of faith and humanity in a time of unimaginable cruelty. It reminds us that in war, not all battles are fought with bullets. Some are fought with compassion, with loyalty, and with the refusal to surrender what makes us human. Even now, historians continue to piece together fragments of the operation. Flight logs, coded radio messages, the testimonies of villagers who remembered the Americans with tears and pride. Yet one question lingers, haunting in its simplicity. How could such a monumental act of courage remain hidden for so long? Was it politics, pride, or the nature of war itself that buried the truth? The answer lies somewhere between silence and survival. The men who escaped Yugoslavia in 1944 carried with them not just stories of rescue, but lessons of honor that outlasted empires. Operation Halyard may have been forgotten by history's first drafts, but in the quiet hills of Serbia, where courage once took flight, its echo still remains. The sound of propellers cutting through the night, carrying men to freedom that Nazi Germany could not stop.